Hi again, and very welcome to the chapter about secrets. This is, I think, another of those cases where we can use different names, different terms to relate to a specific idea. In this case, we're talking about situations where we are analyzing one option for us in a specific position. We're looking at if I do this and they do that and so on. We discover something, there is some very important piece of information, something about their plans, something about our possibilities. And even if the variation that we are looking at, even if this option turns out to be wrong, we can use that information in order to find the best move. So it's a little similar to, you could say, the process of elimination, because we're checking different options and comparing them. But there is some kind of connection between the different options that we have at our disposal, and there is some little detail that we have to discover, and that's the little detail that I call secrets, because it's something that is not evident at first sight when we look at the position. So safe to say, this is a slightly more complex topic about calculation. We can use it at any in any circumstances, in better positions, in worse positions, in the opening, middle game, end game. It's very useful, and I think you have all seen this kind of idea in practice, but perhaps under a different name, like, for example, resulting moves. I think that's what Grandmaster Baim used in his interesting book, very nice book, Chess Recipes from the Grandmaster's Kitchen, or something like that. So basically we're talking about looking into one variation, extract some important things from that variation, important information. We learn from that variation, and we use this new information to find the right way to go. So let's have a look at some examples. I will warn you that the first example, this time in this chapter, specific chapter, it's a little more complex than in the other chapters. I usually try to start with the first example being slightly more simple, but on this occasion it turned out that it's a bit more complex. But I really like this example, so that's the reason why I have it in the first place. So let's have a look. This is an interesting game. Here you can see that black sacrificed a piece in order to attack white's king. Right now, white's king, as you can see, it's very lonely, and there is a concrete threat, evidently, of rook f6, rook h6, and rook h1, something like that. At the same time, of course, we cannot ignore the fact that our rook is under an attack. Playing white here, by the way, Stefan, and playing black, Maurizi. So definitely white is in danger. We have to figure out a way in which we can save our rook and also avoid getting mated. So in the first place, you would think that, okay, let's see what happens if we simply move the rook somewhere. In the game, that's actually what happened. In the game, Stepan played here the move rook g1, saving the rook. Unfortunately, Maurizi didn't hesitate to play rook f6. You can see that now it's very hard to prevent rook h6. In the game, they tried here rook g2 so that the king would be a little safer on g1, but black found a very nice way to invade. They invaded along the first rank, starting with rook h6 check, and after king d1, queen d1 check, king f2. I think you can see black's next move here, right? Very nice move, queen and rook. That's a great attacking team on this occasion. Exactly. They played here rook h1 with multiple mating threats on the f1 square. White could not save this, and I think white gave up material somehow, but they went on to lose this game. So we can say in the first place that if we move the rook, it's probably dangerous for us to allow rook f6. One thing that I wanted you to notice here is that, let's say we stick to this move rook g1 that they played in the game, and black plays rook f6. Okay, it would be great to stop the move rook h6, right? So is there any possible way that we could stop it? That's true, yeah, we have the bishop on that same diagonal. It's just that the pawn is in the way. So ideally speaking, white would like to play e4 so that the rook could be taken by the bishop. But as you can see, in this case, we're also leaving the queen undefended, so black would just take our queen, something like that. But anyway, that's something we learn from this variation. Now that we know that rook f6 is very, very dangerous, I mean the arrival of the rook to h6 is very dangerous, and we look for any way to prevent it. And that's where we see this move e4. So when we learn about this idea, e4, we start looking at other moves. We say, all right, maybe I shouldn't move the rook. I should rather move the queen so that it defends the rook, and at the same time it unpins the e-pawn so that we can play e4, so that if they have the rook on f6, they can't play rook h6. So that would be like white's thought process here. So, all right, where to put the queen? So I think for many of us, it would be natural to play something here like queen e1. We're bringing the queen to the first rank. We get ready to play queen f1. That would be heaven, of course, if we could bring the queen to g2 at some point, obviously without losing track of the after rook on d1, but that would be a great idea. By the way, please notice also that we have this move in the pocket. We have that for later. We can bring the rook in prophylactic fashion to help the king along the second rank, sorry. So let's have a look here if black then continues rook f6, and we will play our intended move e4. Nice. Now we don't have to bother about rook h6 anymore. So is there anything black could do about this? Well, if you look very carefully, you will notice that after the move queen e1, black could actually play things in a different way. After queen e1, they could play a surprising move. You got it. If there is a problem for black on this diagonal, they could start with this move, f4. And that's not difficult to see in the first position, in the initial position. Almost impossible, I would say, to detect this idea in the initial position. So why on earth is black playing like that? Well, it turns out that now, if we play e takes f4, they will play rook f6. In order to clear the diagonal for the bishop, we would play f5, and as you can see, black would stick to the same idea, rook takes f5. And the threat of rook h5, it's simply too much for us to handle. Queen takes e6, unfortunately, it won't change matters too much. Black will play king h8, and there is still rook h5 for white to worry about. They can't really stop this in any good way. So, unfortunately, queen e1, it didn't make it. It didn't make it because after queen e1, black is not hurrying to play rook f6. They play this unexpected move, very unexpected move, f4. You can see that if you take with the g-pawn, it's basically the same thing. I think you could even go to f5 if you like. I think it's a matter of choice. Both are fine, actually. This is difficult for white to handle. So, yeah, what to do then? We will continue looking. We picked up some pieces of information. We know that white would like to go e4, and we know that black, sometimes they have this move f4. We could check something like queen c2 also. Unfortunately, in this case, again, we have the same situation. Black will play this sneaky move f4 so that they can go rook f5 or rook f6 next turn. Again, we take, I think both rook moves are okay here. Maybe even rook f5 would be simpler, right? And we bring the rook to h5. White's agony here is that they would love to play queen g2, of course. But in that case, as you can see, the rook is hanging. So if queen g2, black wouldn't take right now because the rook is hanging on e8, they would first give check so that they can take on d1 with check. So yeah, this is another disaster. I think by now we have looked at, 1, 2, 3 different candidate moves. By now, I think you know what's going on here. When they play f4, if we go back to this position, when they play f4 after, let's say, queen c2, f4, imagine white's queen was still on this side. Yeah, then it would be taken, you would say. But we have a choice, right? We have a choice in this position. Where to put the queen then? We need to protect the rook. Where would you put the queen? That's right. You put the queen on d3. So this is almost impossible to find this move, like just scanning candidate moves, because it's very, very deep, the idea of this move, the tactical idea. So what's the point? Well, if now f4, we can take on f4. You see, now we win a tempo because we're hitting that queen. One tempo is, of course, a lot in this kind of delicate tactical position. So they can't really make f4 work anymore. This would not be a good idea for them. They will have to stick to their original idea instead, rook f6. Of course, you know our next move here. Definitely we should play e4. In this way, we prevent bishop h6. We prevent rook h6, I was going to say. And interestingly here already, it's difficult for black to keep up their attack. One reason why we would perhaps shy away from this move, queen d3, is that we don't like the fact that they can give check on f2. That's what I think, speaking about intuition. Now, most of us would perhaps first look at these moves because we don't like to give black more checking options. But the check is actually not that dangerous. You can play something like, I think in this case, king h1, right? You can play king h1, sorry, king h3. If they try to mate you with g5, I think this won't work. But it would be good to find out why, right? I think we can maybe just hunt the queen with queen d2, maybe? Queen d2, if they go g4, we go king h4. Believe it or not, I think this is okay for white. I don't think we get mated in this position. Also, we can perhaps start some attacking ideas, take on d6 and so on. I think this would be the answer, yeah, probably, if they go queen f2 check, because we really don't want to play king h1, do we? Then they will take on g3 and they will have, again, dangerous attack, or they will maybe play rook f6. Interesting. I didn't think about this actually, but maybe even here they could play rook f6, or maybe even here they could stick to the idea with f4. Yeah, maybe just take on g3. Interesting. So I actually think that we should be a little brave here and play king h3. If they play rook f6, we again have our favorite move here, e4. This looks dangerous, I admit that, but our bishop is well placed for preventing rook h6. And as we were discussing, if they go g5, which would be like the most drastic move here, try to mate. Actually, it's not even mate, right? Because the king is going this way. Interesting. I might be missing some important detail here, but I think actually that white is much better. But I would like to know, of course, which would be the right move. Yeah, I will stick to this move, queen d2. I will probably stick to that one. Yeah, and I think we're okay. But yeah, it's obviously not every day you put the king like that on h4. But I think it will work out rather well in this case. Yeah, if they play queen f3, maybe we can take on d6 and we have a counterattack coming up. Yeah, crazy position, you will say. Bishop e2 is also coming. Interesting. In any case, so queen d3, that's the safest move possibly here, even if they can give check on f2, because in this way we're ready to meet f4 with e takes f4, which means that they don't have time for their intended attack. In the game, they didn't play like this. Yeah, in the game they play rook g1, but in my main line I was saying black plays rook f6, and we hurry, of course, to prevent rook h6. We play here e4. Black doesn't want to trade queens. That's not part of their plans because we have an extra piece. That would be nice for us. That would be a relief for us. So they will play something else here, try to keep the attack going. Queen h5 check. We could go to g1. We could go to g2. Perhaps most natural king g2. However, in that case, we have the problem that they can take on e4. And after we take, there was some tactical problem here, right? Queen takes d1. Oh, I see. And if we take on a8, they go rook f8, and they still have a dangerous attack coming up. So we shouldn't do that. It's better to play king g1, so that if they take on e4, since our queen is not exposed to this check anymore, we could take on d6 instead. Yeah, complex example, definitely. Queen takes d6, and we're comparatively safe. They don't have any immediate checks, and we could perhaps try to bring in the bishop to f4 or something to safeguard our king a little more. We're very happy, by the way, that all the time we have this move, bishop takes h6, in case they play rook h6. So king g1, the strongest move here for black might be g5, insisting with the plan of rook h6. There were two ways to play here, I remember, with the white pieces. There was one like very computerish way of playing, and there was another more human. So I will prefer the human way of playing. I think that generally makes sense. It's difficult to try to play like a computer. We can learn from them, but to play like them all the time, it's very difficult. One slip and we're gone. So what the computer was saying here was to play e takes f5, and after rook h6, it's saying that queen d2 is fine for white. It's just perpetual here. I think it was saying with queen h1 and something like that. But it looks extremely dangerous for the human, so I would definitely prefer, if I have a chance, I would prefer to play something like this instead. We're threatening queen takes d5, and after black defends the pawn, we would, be happy to continue development, maybe something like rook f1 and queen g2. So okay, let's say that black goes all in here. They could play something like this, but I think we could just play rook f1, as I'm saying, and try to bring the queen to g2 to safeguard the king. So let's say they go all in here. Black goes all in. They play here f4. Again, it looks dangerous for white, right? But here I think we should think a little in terms of mobilization, try to bring our pieces to the defense. We would love to play a queen move here, but as you can see, the rook is hanging, so we could develop the bishop, but even nicer would be to play rook f1, because in this case, as you can see, we're also pinning the rook, the pawn, around the f-file. So black will stick to their plan, rook h6, threatening to give check on h1, and we hurry to play, of course, queen g2. The game is definitely not over, but as you can see, white's king is comparatively safe. Black can take this pawn, but even then they wouldn't have a concrete threat in this position. So extremely painstaking example. It's no wonder that white went the wrong way in this example, because it's, for all of us, we talked about that in the introduction to this course, it's difficult to defend. It's more what can I say, demanding than to play for an attack. It's so easy to go wrong. So that's what happened in the game. White unfortunately played rook g1, and black hurried to bring in the rook, and yeah, white was lost in that variation. So we saw that the idea of playing e4 could be interesting at some point, but if we just put the queen on just like any square in order to meet rook f6 with e4, we had the problem that black could actually anticipate our plans, and they could play f4. This was an unexpected little secret, you could say, in this position that we had to figure out, because now the rook is actually able to to get into the action. So for that reason, we should choose very carefully where to put our queen. It looks a little dangerous to allow queen f2, but it's actually better to keep the queen defended in this way. It seems that check is not that dangerous after all, and if they go for f4, they have the problem that we can take it, and we win a crucial tempo by offering the trade of queens. So that's how the story started, and it was a long story even after this, but this was the most important part. Queen d3, we have noticed that the move e4 is very important for us, important resource, and for that reason we need to keep these pieces protected. All right, let's continue with a slightly simpler example, I would say, but again, there is a secret waiting to be discovered. Let's have a look at our next example. We have with the white pieces Buksa and playing black Master of Vasilis, Anastasios. And as you can see in this position, material is equal, but black's king is in danger. White has just played the queen to d4, and we have to see where to go with the king. It looks a little like the previous chapter about the process of elimination. So we only have 3 moves here. Rook f6 is not well, something we would like to play. We out self-pin ourselves, and they would play, I guess, rook b6, and we could not save the rook in any good way. So let's forget about that. So we have 2 options here, king g8 and king h6. Common sense dictates that we should play king g8 because we're safeguarding the king. They can't check us again. So let's say we play king g8. What do you think white would do in that case after king g8? We can play it out, all right. Is there any tactical feature that white could build or play on? It's hard to get at black's king, right? But can you see any possible danger in black's position? It's funny, but even the pawn on a5, you would say this is the least important piece on the board, but even this pawn is important because there is one black piece which is right now short of space. It doesn't have many squares. Aha, you got it. The rook on f5 is very exposed, so white could actually play here the move g4, and this is what happened in the game. Buksa played g4 because he noticed that the black rook was in big danger. There is only 1 square for this rook. It's funny, no? You hardly ever trap a rook on f5. So black had to play here rook f3. As you can see, again, the rook doesn't have many squares. Aha, you got it. White will attack that rook. Don't forget that the king can also be used as an attacking piece. White played king g2. At this point, we have to defend the rook. It would be great to somehow deflect the queen on d4. Please notice, if you had a pawn on e6 or on c6, we would play something like e5 or c5 to get rid of white's queen, because you can see white's queen is covering the pawn on f2, which is very important, and it's also covering some other squares that the rook would like to use. But we can't really get at white's queen either. If by chance you notice that there was this crazy idea of rook d8, to make white's queen go away so that we can take on f2, but you notice that after rook d8, white will take with check. If by chance you notice this, well, congratulations, you have discovered the secret in the position. So anyway, back to the position here after king g2, black played queen e2, white continued rook d2 with the same simple idea of deflecting the queen. Black found the only move here, like smart defense, queen e1, so that king takes f3 can be met by queen h1. Unfortunately, this is just like a short-term arrangement. If white can safeguard the rook on b7, then this will not work for black. The rook will be stuck anyway. Buksa looked for the best possible square for the rook, and she found this square, a very nice square, because also we're actually resuming the attack at black's king. That's how the game went, and white later on went on to win, because, as you can see, there are no good squares for this rook. So strange example, you would say, very strange. White was supposed to be playing for an attack, and suddenly they trapped black's rook instead. So that was basically the secret here, that white is actually after black's rook. So what do you think? What could king h6 possibly change in that way? Why would that be a better choice? Yeah, we touched upon it briefly. King h6, that's the right choice. White doesn't really have any very powerful moves apart from g4. That's definitely the most critical move, g4. Black would play rook f3. You got it. That's the only square that we can use. You can see that, like in the previous example, the very complex example, Stepan Maurizi, we have this kind of crazy king again, but it seems the king is actually doing fine on h5. So white could continue in the same way as before with king g2, and by now, of course, you know the difference. What's the difference of having the king on h6 instead of g8? You would say only disadvantages, but there is actually a big advantage. We can now help our rook because we can launch a counterattack against white's queen. You got it. Now we can play the move rook d8. Very nice, very difficult to see this from the very beginning, but now you see what I'm talking about. If white takes on d8, it's not check anymore because our king is now somewhere else on the board, and we would carry out mate here with queen takes f2 and rook h3. So after rook d8, white will have to play something else. Actually, they have to be a little careful also because also the rook on d1 is hanging. So basically, they will have to take on f3. We take back on d4, and we reach some kind of level endgame here. They can take, yeah, they must take with the rook, I guess, else they probably drop the queen. So they will have to take with the rook, and we could play different moves here. One good move might be queen e6, so that we bring home the queen quickly. We have this check coming up, and obviously we would like to run with the pawn at some point. Maybe white still has slightly better chances here, but it's the best it gets on this occasion. So difficult path to walk down to safety here in this game. Nobody can blame Master Vasilis for playing king g8. That's the most natural move. It was very difficult to see this, especially in move 32, to see that actually king h6 was smarter, because the secret here that white would like to chase black's rook with g4, rook f3, king g2, and with the king on h6, we are able to, believe it or not, launch this very nice counterattack. That was a little secret waiting to be discovered. Not easy at all. This is a complex topic, safe to say. Let's take our next example. I would say the next one is perhaps slightly simpler. I came across it recently. This game with white pieces Teklaf and black is Krisa. You can see that white has a problem on the g file in this Tarrasch structure. Black has recently played rook g6, so how to deal with this threat? Bishop takes g2. We can't protect the pawn in any natural way. We can't obstruct the queen, like with a knight on g3, something like that. The very last option for us would be to play g3, giving up the exchange. You do that sometimes in these defensive situations. You can do that. It's a common pattern, but right here it's not very promising, because simply there are not so many pieces left. So actually black is happy that, for example, white, they don't have a knight on d4, something like that. Difficult to play this position. h5 was one idea for black to continue the attack. Somehow white would have preferred to have a knight on d4, for example, instead of the bishop or something like that. So this is difficult for white. They don't have complete compensation. It's a good pattern to know about, but this is really going to be our last option. But because there would only be two results if we get to that kind of position with g3. So let's look for something else. All right, so we can't really stop bishop takes g2, but once they take on g2, we could look for some intermediate move. There are two pieces protecting this pawn. We would like to deflect black's queen or rook. How could that be done? Well, as you can see, there is something with bishop takes g2. We could go h4. That would be very nice, right? So that the queen takes, and we would then take on g2 and with a piece up, something like that. All right, but to make this work, we probably have to move our queen, because we need to, in the very end, in this variation, if you think about it, let's just presume that it's black to play. Bishop takes g2, we go h4, queen takes h4, bishop takes g2. Black would play something like queen h3, right? We can't defend the bishop on g2. This bishop is undefendable, so to speak. We can't use the f3 square because black would just take our queen. There is still a pin along the g file. So safe to say it's time to use the queen in some way. So where to put the queen? To be honest with you, when I started looking at this example, my clear convincement here was that white should play queen d4. This was like pattern recognition for me, because I saw the idea with h4 rather quickly. And I thought this would be okay for white, but they didn't play like that in the game. So why not? Well, have a look at this, please. Bishop takes d2, we go h4, and what do you think black would play at this point? That's a good point. They will give up the bishop, but they will later on attack it again. They will put the queen on f5, specifically on f5, so that after bishop takes g2, they can go queen f3, and it's game over. Queen d4 definitely didn't work. We will have to look for a different square for our queen. So where else could you put the queen for this to work? Yeah, you can't put the queen on e2. It would make no sense, because then I'll take and h4 will fail to bishop takes, and we take the queen with this discovered attack. So white ends up a piece down. But there is a better square for the queen, and now we're getting closer and closer. Yeah, how could we possibly explain this? Maybe one way to understand it is that in the other line, in this line with queen d4, bishop takes g2, h4, queen f5, bishop takes g2, queen f3. That's what we call a relative pin, right? This is a relative pin. Or no, that's not a relative pin. That's an absolute pin. No, sorry. But what I'm trying to say here is that this kind of situation, it can be a little fragile. I have seen some situations like this where, for example, if you can take this rook in some way, if you have a queen on f5, you could take it. Well, if you had a queen on f5, you would take the queen instead. But okay, let's put the queen somewhere else on c2 or b1. You would take the rook and then you could take the queen. Or you could also think about if you have a king on h8 and you have a bishop on b2, white could play something like queen takes g7. I'm sure you have seen this tactical pattern before, like breaking the pin. Rook takes g7, bishop takes g7, king takes g7, and bishop takes f3. So this kind of thinking could be useful for us. Once we notice that there are a lot of things happening on the G file, we could try to find a way to break the pin. So that explains what Teklov played in the game. He played here the move queen c2 because he knew that it would be important to foresee this situation where black would work on the pin, queen c2. So now, after bishop takes d2, bishop takes d2, white get mated, but we can use our favorite move here, h4. So if black continues with the same business here, queen takes h2 and bishop takes and queen h3, we could immediately win the game here. You got it by queen takes g6. All right, you could say, but this is not necessary. I can just play f3. And in a way, you're right, because in this way, we connect the bishop with the queen. On the other hand, black could, instead of taking the pawn on h4, they could play the more tricky move queen f6. So that after bishop takes g2, they would play queen f3. It would be basically the same picture sorry, that we saw before. Unfortunately for black at this point, since white's queen is on c2 instead of d4, you got it, definitely. They will play here queen takes g6. So this was like the little secret that was waiting to be discovered here. Queen takes g6 and white wins the game, yeah, because they're breaking the pin. So what else could black play after h4? Yeah, queen takes h4, we were talking about this, and bishop takes g2. You might ask yourself, is it so important to put the queen on c2? What if I put her on b1 instead? Isn't that also possible? But if we look into that, if you play queen b1 here, you can see that bishop takes g2, h4, black would play queen takes h4, bishop takes d2, and now, since the queen is not on the second rank, what do you think black would play? Aha, we have two good options here. We can pick one of them, queen g4, right? And black wins. So for that reason, we have to have our queen on c2. That was like another little secret to be discovered, that after bishop takes g2, h4, queen takes, bishop takes g2. If black plays queen g4 or queen g5, we are simply able here to play f4. So that's the reason why we have to have the queen on c2 specifically. It must protect the bishop, and it must be ready in the other line, I mean, where black played queen f6 like that. And after bishop takes d2, queen f3, we must be ready also to take on g6. That's why the queen cannot be on, for example, d2. It must be on c2 to make this work, this counter sacrifice. So, all right, you probably want to know what happened in the game. Yeah, white Teklov noticed this idea. He played queen c2 after bishop takes g2, h4, queen takes h4, bishop takes d2. And Krysa, of course, also understood that this attack was not working, so he hurried to fix a draw here by rook takes g2, check, king takes d2, queen g4, king h2, queen h4, and the game was soon a draw. So nice little example, very tricky. I used it a few times with students already. It was not always that simple to see all these tactical details, but the fact that the grandmaster saw this in the game also shows that it's not some crazy computer variation. It's something that we can definitely manage, but we have to be very careful checking here the different options and make sure that we notice this detail with the sacrifice on g6. Okay, let's continue. Our next example, I would say, is of a slightly more quiet nature. Well, not so quiet after all. This is Gareev with white and Christopher Yu playing black. What's going on here? Strategically, black is okay, but you would say white is more active at this point. Opposite castle kings, white is playing for an attack. You can see that there is a concrete threat. White is about to win a pawn. How could I do that? Well, you got it. There is something going on with this bishop and this pawn. White would play bishop takes h7, king takes, and queen d3. In that case, actually, they wouldn't play for an attack anymore. They would take on d7, and they would end up with an extra pawn. We have to avoid that, of course. So what can we do here with black? One first thing, I think that at least one of the first moves that I see here with black is this move, knight b4. It's not a good move, but I think, like Jennifer Sahadi said once in a lecture, a bad move can lead to a good move. This is actually an important resource for black, knight b4. It's not working right now because the bishop on e7 is like overloaded. So white would just, you see my point, right? Knight b4, I'm attacking the queen and I'm trying to take the bishop on d3. But white would take on e7. You can see that this backfires completely. We cannot take back because now white can take that knight, right? And if we take their queen, they will take ours, and we have tactical issues here, some pieces hanging and so on. So that's not working. But the idea as such is, that's like a first secret here to understand that knight b4 is something that black would like to play at some point. All right, so we have this situation with bishop takes h7. We should try to prevent it somehow. Yeah, we don't want to play g6. That's a very ugly move. It will just help white to continue their attack. At some point, they will try to play, I don't know, they will take maybe, and they will play h5. So h6 is what Christopher Yu played in the game. Very natural move. Unfortunately, he ran into problems here. White played a very clever move, which I think was not completely foreseeable from the very beginning. You would look at moves like bishop takes e7, or retreating the bishop, or leaving the bishop there. He left the bishop there. Gareev, he played here the very nice move, bishop c2. That's a really clever move, because you can see opening up the d file and at the same time preparing this very strong threat of queen d3. So difficult for black already, this position. What did Christopher Yu play? He took on g5, a takes g5. White simply took back on g5. Now it's very hard to find a good defense against the threat of queen d3. Black tried f5 in obstructive spirit to close the door for the bishop on c2. However, white simply took back on they took on f6, I mean, and after bishop takes f6, they played queen d3 anyway. This was very painful for black. You can see that their king is attacked from different angles in this position. There is no real safe place for it. The bishop is also hanging. Black tried queen b6, counterattack against b2, and white uncorked a nice sacrificial move here. What do you think white played? With a little imagination. That's right. Yeah, we won't take, of course, on d7. This checker wait. He played here the move rook h8. Very clever, so that after king f7 we can pick up the bishop on d7. So that's what happened in the game, and white went on to win. h6, a very natural move, but if you consider that we are really keen on playing knight b4, and at the same time we see this pattern with the h file opening up, and white having this strong move bishop c2 at their disposal, how do you think we could somehow adjust the variation here to make it work a little better? Some similar move, but with the same idea. That's right. Black's best move here is slightly ugly, but this is much stronger, f6, because in this case, as you can see, our bishop is not challenged anymore, which means that knight b4 will always be in the air from here onwards, and at the same time also the h5 is not completely closed, in the sense that if we later take, we could play something like g6, an option that it wasn't really the same thing in the other case because the h5 was open. So this would have been a much better choice. Let's have a quick look at the variations here. If now bishop c2, trying to get queen d3 in, you can imagine what black would play, right? Aha, that's right. We are now in time to play knight b4. We won't take on g5, because in that case I think white could play something similar to the game. They could play queen d3, and again it's dangerous for black. Maybe here g6 we could perhaps just take on d7. So instead, after bishop c2, black's best move here would be knight b4, simply trying to eliminate that bishop. Actually, we're winning the bishop because also the rook is there. So this would be a complete disaster for white. Please notice here with the pawn on f6, if you take the same position, h6, bishop c2, and you play knight b4 here, you can see that it's also not working. It's the same thing as we saw before. We would take and take on b4. So that's the big point here. If we play f6 instead, we really like to play knight b4. So white will have to play something else here. Queen c2 is what I looked at. In a way, we're trying to like meet knight b4 with bishop takes, and then bring the queen to g6. That would be white's best shot. Obviously, they can't just play any move because also the bishop is hanging. So let's have a look at queen c2. Black could take immediately, but in that case, like we were discussing, there would be a problem here with bishop takes h7, and the queen would come to the attack very quickly, and also we can take. So this would be something to avoid with black. It's better to try to safeguard the king first here, or look for some kind of tactical option. So knight e5 is a good move here. Knight b4, it has the problem again that black can take and bring the queen to g6. We would love to play bishop e8, but in that case, it's also hanging here. So yeah, some tactical complexities, many pieces hanging and so on. If possible, we should try to find a simpler way. So Simpler way here would be to play knight e5. Basically the same idea as knight before, right? We are attacking the queen by means of this discovered attack, and at the same time we're ready to trade off their most dangerous minor piece, the bishop on d3. But the, you could say, added value is that we cover this square so that the queen cannot go there. So bishop takes h7, we have to go to h8 here to avoid getting mated, so king h8. And now, unfortunately for white, many pieces are in the air. It's not clear how they can save everything. I think if, yeah, we can sometimes just take also. What's the best move for white? I think they will have to sacrifice something. Something like queen e4 was interesting also. Yeah, what will happen in the case of queen e4? Wow, we like to play bishop c6. I don't know if this works. Yeah, crazy variation. Now rook takes d8, bishop takes, and we could take back on d8. But then it's hanging on e5. Yeah, I'm not sure actually. This is perhaps also okay for black, but okay, white has a pawn and they have the bishop pair, so maybe not completely convincing. Queen e4, what would we play against queen e4? We don't want to take because then they get a very strong attack. So is there any other move? Rook c4 is like an interesting idea also. Or maybe we should just take on f3. Yeah, maybe that's the safest choice. We can take on f3 perhaps, and they don't have a good way of untangling. Is that so? Wow, I find these variations very interesting. Yeah, what would be the best choice here? Knight takes f3, maybe rook c4. Rook c4 looks interesting also. Yeah, maybe. Knight e4, and what would happen next here? Yeah, complex position. Maybe not fully convincing for black. I feel like I would lose with either color in this position. Yeah, what would we then possibly play? Yeah, something to look at. Maybe we should just take on f3 then, and they'll have to take back. And what would be our best move here? Maybe now we can play bishop c6. Is that so? Maybe. Yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe they can now go queen g6. It's also not completely evident what's going on here. Maybe we can trade queens. Interesting. Yeah, I'm not completely convinced what's going on here. I think we have this also in the pocket. Hard to analyze this, especially if you're sitting there at the board moving the pieces. In any case, king h8, what I looked at was rook takes d7, giving up the exchange, and black would play knight takes d7, avoiding knight takes e5 with threat. Yeah, queen g6, and now we saw the idea already. We should, of course, avoid queen h5, so we can do that by playing queen e8. And we end up in a similar endgame like the one that we were just looking at, right? Bishop f4, and we hurry to trade queens. Queen takes, bishop takes, and rook def d8. So I don't think white is worse here, really, in this position. White has also their good things here, bishop pair, and they have a pawn for the exchange, but black is okay. It's, in any case, much better than the game. So basically, what I wanted to show you here is that we had this situation with different candidate moves. After checking the variations, we'll notice that knight b4 is a key resource in black's position, and for that reason it's better to play f6, because then we can get the move knight b4 in and we can create counterplay. h6 was well intended, but unfortunately white was not going to take on e7. That's perhaps what Christopher Yu was expecting, but Garay found this killer move, bishop c2, extremely strong, preparing to go queen d3. Next turn. All right, time to move on. Our next example is about an endgame. This is also a good approach. As I told you in the beginning, we can use it at any stage of the game. Here is an endgame example. It's one of my favorite examples. Black went wrong, and many students, they also went wrong when solving this exercise, because there is a very natural move and it's not correct. Let's see if we understand this together. It's black to play. You can see typical Karpov structure. It's Savchenko with white and Kotenko playing black. White is happy to have the knight versus the bishop. It's not a bad bishop, of course, but the knight is more clever in this kind of compact pawn structure. And as you can see, there is a clear target on c6 that white would like to attack. By pattern recognition, I think most of us, the first move that we see here is to play white's last move, by the way, knight d3. So by pattern recognition, many of us would play bishop d6 here to restrict the knight. And that's exactly what black played in the game. Unfortunately, this loses the game. Believe it or not, this innocent-looking move actually loses the game. What's the problem here? Well, we should detect the threat very carefully. The threat was actually not so much to play knight e5. If we go back to the initial position, there is a different threat, and it's hard to see this unless we work out the variations. If we play bishop d6, what white would like to do here, they would like to put the knight on c5. And after bishop takes e5, they will take the pawn on c6, and they are profiting from this pin along the c-file. So that's unfortunately what happened in the game. Kotenko played bishop d6, and white play the nice move knight c5. As you can see, the pawn is definitely doomed on c6. When that pawn falls, the pawn on d5 also becomes a weakness. After bishop takes e5, rook takes e5, you can see that there is no good solution for black. White will actually take with the rook on c5. Sorry, in this position they'll take with the rook on c5, which means that either way they take the pawn, or the black ends up in a lost pawn endgame. As you know, pawn endgames with a minus pawn almost always very difficult to save. So that's the kind of nightmare that struck black in the game. What else could you play here? Well, there actually aren't many other options, but now that you know the story, now that you know that white would like to play knight c5 and bishop takes e5 and rook takes e6, what do you think black should do? What would be the best move for black? We can't really avoid knight c5, but we could try to take actions for it. And one way would be to work against the pin already at this point. How could that be done? Well, putting the rook on a dark square, where it can be protected by the bishop. So rook c3, that would be the best move here, as you can see. Now, if knight c5, we will take back, and white cannot take on c6 for multiple reasons. Now we will just unpin the bishop here with, let's say, bishop takes d4. So as simple as that, but I would say not a simple move to see in practice, rook c3. By the way, if you thought about playing rook d2, it's a slightly different story. By simple comparative analysis, you can say this must be worse because we're not we're not defending the pawn on c6 anymore. So white will have an extra chance here. Knight e5 would be a good move, targeting the pawn. We will see this in the main line also, but here I wanted you to notice that after c5, rook a7, it's actually tricky for black to keep everything defended here. King f6, d takes e5. If we had the rook on the c file, we would simply take back, I was going to say, but we can't do that because then we're getting forward. So that's not correct. Now we will probably take on c5. Yeah, what will be the difference here? Yeah, interesting. If I take here, no, that's the difference, right? Now they get 97. Yeah, that's of course the difference. But if you have the rook on the c file, this would not be a big threat because in that case, they would just take back. Yeah, exactly. That's how it works, right? Anyway, don't worry, we will come back to this. So rook d2, by comparative analysis, it must be worse than rook c3, but still, of course, we should have a look at it. And the answer is probably that white will play knight e5, we'll have to play c5 to safeguard that pawn. They won't take, they will first play this tricky move, trying to force our king to a worse square, and after king f6, they will just take, or they could also perhaps play, yeah, even knight e7 looks interesting, right? And we take the pawn. But okay, I was thinking about this in the first place. And as you can see, bishop takes fails to, yeah, they don't take this pawn. They go for knight e7 instead. Knight e7. So, okay, enough talking. Rook c3, that's the best move here. Knight c5 backfires due to bishop takes e5. And if the rook takes, we can unpin the bishop since our rook is now defendable for the bishop. White will have to play knight e5 instead. It will still be slightly unpleasant, but we can save our skin here by accurate defense. c5, safeguarding the pawn. If white now plays rook a7, you can see that we should not play king f8 because they will take on c5 and we drop this pawn on f7 in a bad way. No, we don't want to have our king on f8 when they take on f7. On the other hand, if you have the king on f6, you can see the difference. If they now take, we can take back, and if they, yeah, for starters, we're actually hitting the knight, so they can't take on f7 with the rook. If they take with the bishop, with the knight, I mean, they lose their rook, right? It's important to look at the whole board. So this is not fully satisfactory for white. D takes e5, bishop takes e5. I guess they will have to play knight e7, and we can just put our king on e6. Yeah, why did you put the king on e6 and we don't put it on g7? Yeah, I think if you put it here, maybe they have rook a5, right? And they're targeting this pawn. Yeah, very tricky endgame, no? Very tricky endgame. So king e6 is probably better because we keep track of both pawns. Yeah, this would just be complete, almost complete equality. Even without the pawn in the very worst case, you will probably be able to defend this endgame, but it's nicer to have the pawn there, of course. King e6, white could play rook c7, working on the pin again, and we can play here several moves, but okay, simplest it seems, bishop b4, and we keep everything defended. So not so simple. Main point of this example was to notice that actually this is a big threat. It's like in the spirit of our first chapter, detecting the threat. Since this is coming up, bishop takes, rook takes c6, we should make sure that we can unpin the bishop. For that reason, we should play here rook c3, which looks, I mean, honestly, in my opinion, it looks like a silly move, because hey, why you attacked the knight and the knight, it wanted to move anyway. But yeah, that's how chess tactics work somehow. This is the best move for black. But we can only find it if we discover the little secret here in the position that white's about to play knight c5 and work on the c-file, on the pin on the c-file. Okay, we should move on. Our next example is another endgame. And if this one was difficult, the last one, I think this one is even more difficult. Nisipiano with white and Volokitin playing with the black pieces back in the German Bundesliga some year ago. You can see that the white is pressing in this endgame, they're a pawn up, and funny position because the rook is actually hanging, but obviously if black takes it, there is knight takes c6 and with the fork, so that cannot be played by black. So what do you think black should play here? At this point, we're at the move number 31, approaching time trouble. Black made a wrong choice and they lost the game at this very moment. It's a critical moment in the game. First thing, of course, you would look at this, okay, I can just take the pawn on e5, saving the rook, but then white will take on b6 and they will have a sound extra pawn. You can see the e pawn is a passed pawn. Definitely it's going to be a long afternoon for black in this game. So after we have seen that, we're saying, okay, I don't want to move away the rook because it's defending the pawn. I should move the king instead, so that bishop takes d6, knight takes d6, it won't come with check. So where to put the king? In the game, Volokitin played, for the human eye, the most natural move. He played in the game king e8, bringing the king a little closer. This is, after all, the file on which white's passed pawn is supposed to queen, so it makes sense to have the king there. Unfortunately, what he didn't fully notice here was that white has no reason to move the rook anywhere. White can play this sneaky move, king f4. Very, very clever, because in this way we protect the pawn and we get ready to actually invade with the king. We get ready to invade with the king. g5, king f5, it's no advantage for black, no merit of this move. It's only problems. White's king is getting closer. If rook b2, white could just play rook d2, I think, just like in the game. Now white is very happy to trade rooks because they're a pawn up and it's a very powerful passed pawn, while this pawn is, yeah, okay, both sides have double pawns, but what I'm trying to say is that white's passed pawn is very strong. It's an extra pawn. So in the game, Volokitin played here rook b1, trying to cook up counterplay, but Nisipiano played solid move here, rook d2, so that checks in the back can be met by rook f2. Black played king e7, and they're just one move away from relative safety. King e6 would be great, then even there we could play maybe g5 and take the pawn. But what do you think white played at this point? That's right, we're talking endgame plans here, endgame ideas, endgame strategy. They played king f5, bringing the king closer, denying black of this move. You can see that white could even consider to play e6 and try to play rook d7. The king can sometimes invade also on g6, and that is no problem with rook f1 because we can always play rook f2. Actually, this happened in the game. Black went back with the rook and white went back with the knight. Yeah, this was very unpleasant for black. Now there are like multiple threats here, but one big idea for white is to play king g6 and then rook f7 because black's pieces are in disarray. Black played king g7 and there was indeed king g6. You can see that if black takes on d6, they will probably lose the game on the king side now. White can just take back, pawn takes, king takes, and just, I think, just take. And this pawn should decide the battle. So yeah, very difficult for black. They played bishop e7 and I think white played knight f5, right? Yeah, white played knight f5, targeting this pawn. Black tried a last chance for counterplay. And interestingly, white didn't take this pawn, knight or king. They found a much better move. Think about pawn endgames. Think about what we learn as beginners when we, when they teach us pawn endgames. You're right, king f7. Very clever, very beautiful move. What a nice king maneuver by Nisipiano in this game. In view of the move e6 next turn, black resigns. So this was like the secret to be discovered here. King e8. It's not a good move because white will then play king f4 since the fork motif is still around. Black's definitely losing the battle against white's passed pawn, or the main thing for black is to eliminate that passed pawn. So, all right, now that you know the story, what do you think black should play? Which would be the best move? If it's an unnatural move, counterintuitive move, don't worry, it might be the best move anyway. That's right, almost impossible to see this move. Just checking your candidate moves. It wouldn't be on your list, perhaps. King g8, we should go back with the king, against breaking the rules, against the logic of bringing in the king. But that's what you have to play, because now, tactically speaking, you are indeed threatening to take the rook. And at the same time, you are about to take the pawn. So this would lead to problems for white. Obviously, if they defend both things, we can just come back, right? It would not be a big benefit for For white, if they play something like 96 here, I think we could just take and take maybe. Is that what we will play? Or would we take... Yeah, different choices, right? We could take like this and take like that. That could be okay, although I don't like the fact that I have these double pawns, but... Yeah, probably this is okay also. We can try to bring over the king to that side, although they could play e4, but can they really progress after that? Not so simple now. This would be one option. Another option would be if we play after 96, if we take on d6, they take, we get to the rook endgame. Yeah, actually I don't know. I would say this one is worse because they have an extra pawn. Yeah, I wouldn't play this one. And with this, if the pawn was on the f-file instead, we would just perhaps try to trade off these two pawns. But here it's a passed pawn. So I think I will go for the other one. Yeah, I'll go for this one, and I will hope that I can make it. After all, the bishop looks rather strong in this endgame with an open center. So probably if white goes back to e6, we can also go to f7. And we will probably repeat the position here. So what else could I play here? Well, they could put the king on f4, trying to give up the exchange to help the passed pawn. But yeah, it's not so dangerous now. We can take, no matter how they take back, it's not really that dangerous. If they take with the pawn, I think we can just bring in the king, just make sure that we don't run into any forks here, but I don't see any forks. d7, king e7. They can take with the knight, of course, but this would be very speculative. I think we talked about this in some other example. Yeah, I know in which example. In the Lifeline chapter, we talked about that. There was this game played in Armenia where blacks, if you remember, rook f8, going for the trade of rooks, and then there was a black passed pawn, but white king came close to it, something like that. So here you just move the rook somewhere, I don't know, rook here, and you play king f8, and it will take ages for white to advance that pawn, if you see what I mean. This is not dangerous because we're just in time, and they are going to have a hard time making that pawn push further. No, yeah, you can play knight f5 and e7, but after that it basically stops. So this doesn't really work. Their best move after the unnatural king g8 would be rook d7, taking control of the 7th rank and trying to take this pawn next turn. All right, we will take... There was one variation that I wanted to discuss also. Which was the other variation? Give me just one moment, please. Which was the other way where you could give check? Yeah, well, how was that variation? Rook e6, we looked at rook g6. Was that the variation? Rook g6, rook takes. No, this was not what I was thinking about. This is also okay. Yeah, rook takes, and we can give the check first, and then swing over the rook and take the pawn. That would give good drawing chances. Sorry, rook d7, rook takes e5, rook takes b7, and we can play here rook f5. Yeah, this looks like exactly what we just checked, right? We give check first so that the king will have to step back, then we go and take this pawn, like king g4 or king e2. We go to a5, and I was going to say, but it seems I wouldn't. I play rook e5 first. What would be the point of that? Anyway, I don't think there is a big difference. This should also be okay for black. But okay, in my notes, I have rook e5 first. Yeah, interesting. Maybe we want to put white's king in the dark square. Yeah, that's probably the reason, right? King e4, now we do it. Rook a5, rook takes, and rook takes a2. I think here it's actually much easier to make a draw. We're very active with the rook. Without rooks on the board, this would be perhaps complex, but... here we should have great chances to make a draw thanks to our active rook. And sometimes we can, yeah, the bishop is well placed. It can be used for counter-attacking means. In any case, this is the best it gets. This is our least of evils, you could say. It was not easy to see this move, king g8, at all. We had to discover that the more natural move, king e8, unfortunately, it invites white to play this silent move, very strong move, defending the pawn while getting ready to invade with the king. So for that reason, we have to go the other way around, king g8, so that if king f4, we are ready to take on d6 without getting forked by white's knight. And I think we have only 2 examples left. I wanted to show you that this kind of secret thinking, we have seen defensive examples here, right? But I would say most of the time it's actually the stronger side which uses it. It's very common in tactical combinations, in prophylactic play, in positional play, this kind of secret thinking. Here is one example where white is better in this game. We're playing with the white pieces here, Sands white and Brodowski playing black. You can see that it's a complex game. Black has 2 very strong knights in the middle, but on the other hand, right now they are a pawn down, and also there is the strong threat of knight e5 coming up. So why to play? Would you play knight e5 straight away, just making sure the knight settles on that strong square? Well, that's what happened in the game. White played knight e5 in the game, and black had to take. You can see the fork, they have to take on f1 with check while it's possible. And then after bishop takes, queen takes a6. Actually, black was okay in this position. They can keep the balance here. They can bring the rook to f8 and so on. Black later on went on to win. Brodowski finally prevailed on this game. So knight e5 is a move that we would like to play, but it's slightly annoying that they can just take and then take back. So that's like the secret here, that black needs to meet knight e5 with rook takes f1. So once you have noticed that, it's actually not so difficult to find the best move. You should make knight d5 work next turn. How can that be done? Well, don't let them take our rook with check. Where to put the rook? Well, there aren't so many squares, right? You got it, rook f2. Simple, kind of prophylactic thinking, you could say, or secret thinking. We know that if they take on e6, we'll go knight e5, and this time, unfortunately for them, they cannot. After knight takes knight e5, they can, if they take on f2, we of course take the queen. So we win here a lot of material. They will have to play something else after our nice little move, rook f2. I don't know if we should call this prophylaxis or maybe secret thinking or preparatory play or flexibility, many names here. In any case, it's a good move. Black could play something like rook f8, giving up the exchange, but we should probably have a nice advantage here. Knight e5, they will have to play queen takes e6. We pick up the exchange, knight takes, rook takes. It's true that their knights are very prominent in the center, but also there are other pieces on the board. We can start with bishop f1 so that we connect the queen to the rook, and later on perhaps bring over a rook to this side. White is not winning here, but it's a nice material advantage. We can perhaps go for an attack slowly here later on in this game. So, okay, interesting example, not so difficult perhaps. We want to play knight e5, but we don't want them to take on f1. That's the little secret here, that black is relying on that idea. For that reason, we should play this preparatory move. And now, I can't see any move for black here, apart from taking the pawn. I don't know if there is anything else. Queen g7, it seems I looked at also. So that if knight e5, you could then take on e6. I guess this was the point, right? Aha. But white can be more flexible. You can see that queen and king on the same file. That makes up for some tactical motives. You got it. We can play a long and strong move here, rook g3, adding knight h5 to the menu. So this is not fully satisfactory for black either. So nice move, nice little move, rook f2. They didn't play it in the game. They missed a big opportunity. In this case, they would basically have won the exchange because black cannot live with this move. They cannot support it, so to speak. All right, last example. It's on the same topic, you could say, but a bit more complex. We have this typical middle game from the San Sebastian variation, you know, the one with knight takes d5 in the Tarrasch, d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, knight f6, c takes d5, knight takes d5, and e4, knight takes, pawn takes. Very solid line. White gets a pawn center, but black is solid, and they have a queenside pawn majority. That's how we ride at this game, played between Cantor with white and Chandra with the black pieces. So, as you can see here, white is playing for an attack. They have already several pieces well placed for that purpose. The queen, the knight, the bishop. It's rather easy to see here that a rook lift might be in the air. White would like to play something like rook e3, swing over the rook to g3, g6. We're already thinking about sacrificing or maybe putting the knight on f6 and so on. So let's have a look at that. That's like the most obvious move, rook e3. Let's go into this variation and see if we can learn from it something. So, all right, rook e3, black, they can't really prevent rook g3. They could try to activate their piece in knight e5, bringing back the knight to the battle and also enabling perhaps at some point counterattack with a rook. Okay, white will continue with their plan, rook g3. Now black must defend this pawn. We don't really want to move the f pawn right now. It would invite maybe queen g6, things like that. We will prefer to play here g6. Now, as you can see, since the knight is covering f6, it's not that dangerous. If they settle on f6, we can perhaps just take it, and yeah, we can look for some counterattack here. Perhaps queen, I don't know, queen d6 maybe. Is that possible to try to take that pawn possibly? Also, we're pinning this rook in some tactical variation. Maybe there is something better, but I think this should still be holdable for black. Or I wonder if we could play h5 also. Interesting. Or maybe queen f4 is dangerous. They're targeting this square. Yeah, maybe we shouldn't play that. I was just thinking which would be the best way to continue here. Rook d7, that looks like a nice move also, right? We're targeting the pawn on d7. And you can see that whenever they sacrifice, we're happy that our rook is covering the seventh rank, sorry. So coming back to that, if white sacrifices here, that's of course the first move to check. If white sacrifice on g6, you can see that pawn takes, queen takes. I think they don't even have a threat here, right? They don't have a big threat here. And we could even play something like knight f4. Please notice here, very important to understand, the rook on c7, it's the typical prophylactic rook. It means that if white takes on f4, we take back and we don't get mated because our rook is there. So I would say this is a little related to what would be the secret in this position, that black's rook is very important in the defensive labor. In this way they can keep track of the position. Here they are actually a piece up, so they should be okay. And also you can see that there are some threats like maybe rook check and queen takes and something like that. So I think in the game what Cantor considered here was that if he could get rid of that rook, it would help his attacking potential. So he played a move which perhaps is not completely evident, because we're usually saying that when we are attacking, we should not trade pieces. However, that's exactly what white did. They traded something here. So how do you think that could happen? Definitely, we're talking about that rook. We have one piece which we didn't even talk about in all these variations. Exactly, the rook on d2. He played here rook c2 in order to trade off the rook on c7. Black can't really do that much at this point. They played in the game knight e5. I think the best move was to play here rook dc8, so that we actually keep the rook. I looked a little at this, but it was still a complex battle. Yeah, rook e3, knight e5, rook takes e7, rook takes e7, rook g3, and g6. As you can see, we keep the rook here, so after bishop takes, pawn takes, queen takes, we can probably play... Yeah, we can't play knight f4 anymore, by the way. Please notice things change here now, because now after knight takes, queen takes, we don't have the back rank covered. So what would white play? Definitely queen check. But for that reason, after queen takes g6, black could play something like bishop c8 instead, protecting this pawn. And it seems black can just make it here to save this game. Rook f3 wins the pawn on h6, but black can play queen g8 and queen takes h6, rook. You have to play rook f7, or else there is rook f8. Yeah, what do you think? Not so easy to see all this at the board, right? But black is in perfect control here. It's very, very important to have the knight covering the square on f6. So this would be a better choice for black. Not so easy to see all this. Black generally didn't play like this in the game. I think white will have to play in the same way, rook e3, knight e5, trade on c7, and after rook g3, g6, they will probably have to play knight f6 anyway. And in this way, you could say that after knight takes f6, pawn takes f6, I think that actually white is helped by the trade of the rooks on d2 and d8, so to speak. That's what they achieved by playing rook c2. Why am I saying that? Well, because very often when you have a pawn like on this one on f6, or if you have a white pawn like on h6, like in some variations in the Grunfeld, for example, then you're actually happy to trade rooks, because the the 8th rank becomes more important. It's more fragile for black. It's more vulnerable. So I think still here, probably the computer will say it's equal, but I think the human is happier to play white in this position. It will be easier to play white. There are more pitfalls for black to look out for some move like that, or maybe queen f4, some trick over there, and so on. So this would have been white's best shot probably, but objectively black's okay, but in practical play I would say white is better here. Now let's check what happened in the game. Rook e3 was what we looked at in the first place, but knight e5, we're saying that rook g3, g6, and the sacrifice is not very promising, because black is keeping the 7th rank under control. So the Hungarian grandmaster played rook c2 instead. Black should have tried this move to keep the rook defended, but he played knight e7. And by now, I'm convinced that you know exactly what will happen in this game, right? Aha. You just follow the variation that we looked at in the first place. We learned from that line. We learned that the rook on c7 was very important. Now that rook is gone, so let's just continue with the game. They didn't play like that, but I looked at this also. Yeah, we can check this first if you like. So, knight e5, that brings us back to the game. Okay, to make a long story short, he played in the game knight b5. Yeah, funny move, like the lifeline idea, right? Like bishop takes, fails to rook takes. So this actually leads to the same thing, because they took and then rook e3. So that's how they got into the game, sorry. Knight e5 and now rook g3. Now you see what's going on here, right? g6, I don't have to ask you twice for white's next move, right? That's correct. Without the rook on the 7th rank, it's a different story. Basically, we traded our passive rook for their key defender on c7. So bishop takes, g6, of course, pawn takes, queen takes, And at this point, there is the concrete threat, if I'm not mistaken, of knight g7. This is very nasty for black, with queen takes coming up next turn. Knight f4, yeah, as you can see, this time it won't work because we have the mate on g7. So black played in the game queen e7, and I told you already about the best move. Aha, that's completely right. White has this sneaky move knight g7, and there is no way we can really defend against this. Queen takes h4, I guess. Simplest choice would be just to play rook h3. There is probably something more flashy to play here, but okay. We could perhaps start with this one, and we are completely winning. So yeah, black resigned at this point. Oh, actually, I looked at this. Sorry. Rook h3, that was my human move, but knight takes e6, that's the best move. Okay, we can agree about that. Interesting. Would rook h3 have been promising as well? Maybe there is some smart tactic here, like knight f4. I guess that's the problem. You see, if you don't focus, if you don't concentrate, you end up making some silly mistake. That's what I just did, right? Rook takes, knight takes, and black is probably winning here. Yeah, very, very careful. Even when you have the win in the pocket, so to speak, you have to be a little careful. Knight g7, queen takes h4. Do whatever you like. Don't play my move. Yeah, just take on e6, and we are completely winning. All right, this is what happened in the game. Why did this happen? Because white noticed that the rook was a key player here in black's defense. So let's first try to trade it off. Of course, we're not forcing the trade, but now we're definitely ready for our main plan. We have some kind of liability in black's position. They have to use the rook to defend this knight, for example. So that's definitely the best choice here. Okay, this was the last example. Let's have a quick look at what we have checked in this chapter about secrets. Our first example, complex example. Wow, this is really painstaking. No wonder that white went down in this game. Very tough position to defend, but okay, our conclusion was that queen d3 was the only working move here, because black has two ideas, one to bring the rook and then others to include f4 first, and in this way we can fight against both, because specifically after f4 our queen is defended, so we can take the pawn. We win a crucial tempo. We don't let them carry out their intended plan. So very important kind of thinking. We discovered the little secret that f4 was coming up, and we defend our queen in advance, so to speak. Next example. If you find king h6 over the board, congratulations, then you're really good with calculation, and also you know the concept of secrets, because that's the only way to save black here. In the game they went to g8 instead, and after that white played g4 and white played g4 and the rook was trapped after king g2, something like that. But if we have the king on h6 instead, this means that we have this very nice counterattack, rook d8, because it doesn't fall with check. That's the secret in this case. In our next example, we saw that black was toying with some attacking possibilities on the g file. Our only correct square for the queen was on c2, so that we would have this sacrifice sometimes, and also that defense on some occasion. The key variation here, bishop takes h4, queen f6, bishop takes g2, queen f3. This was the key variation where we would have queen takes g6. This was very important to notice. Black didn't let this happen. They found a way in the game to fix a draw instead by rook takes and queen takes. But okay, queen g4, that's another story. We were interested mainly in saving white and not having to give up the exchange by the lazy move g3. So queen c2, very precise defense, almost something like geometry, I would say. Next example, Garev, that was a tough case for black, but okay, in short, knight b4 was a key resource. For that to work, we have to play f6, even if it's a little ugly, weakening move. This is the way to continue, because in that case our bishop is not deflected and we can play knight b4 next turn. We saw in the endgame, tricky endgame, rook c3, only move basically here, because else we'll lose something. White's main threat was not knight e5, white's main threat was knight c5, followed by rook takes e6, and for that reason we need to have the rook on the dark square so that we can play something like bishop b4 or bishop takes d4. Similar case about unnatural moves. Volokitin should have played king g8, even if it's a strange looking move. It's the way to continue here, because if we go king e8, white has no reason to move the rook. They can play king f4. This was the little secret to be discovered. That's what actually decided this game. Active king, key ingredient in the end game. We saw two examples about using secret thinking in superior positions. Here we would like to play knight e5, but we don't want them, of course, to take with check. So for that reason we play rook f2. You can also see, by the way, I forgot to mention, if black takes, we just take back. This is no problem for it. It's nice for white, because actually it's a good trade for them, and we keep the same kind of idea in the pocket here. So rook f2, that's a clever move, preparing to go knight d5 without allowing black to take with check. And in the last example, the one we just looked at, rook c2, it's almost impossible, I would say, to find this move or to settle for this move if we don't check rook e3, rook g3 first, and we learn about some things in that variation. For example, that black's rook is very important along the 7th rank. So for that reason, we start with rook c2, trying to trade off that rook, and only after that we continue with our attacking plan, the rook lift to g3. Secret thinking. All right, thanks, and see you in the next chapter.